Good afternoon. It's indeed a pleasure to be speaking here. I was really surprised as I was walking through the lobby to run into a number of people that I have known and worked with in the drug and alcohol testing arena over, unfortunately, I have to say it's over 30 years, which really, that doesn't just mean that I've got a lot of experience, it means I'm old. But so my assigned topic today is to really do probably some material that I know the most about, because it's really where I spent the majority of my career, was in the federal service, developing drug and alcohol testing programs, first for the U.S. Army, later for Department of Defense, and then lastly, or in the 1980s and 90s, for the Department of Transportation. So what I've been asked to do is to take you through a regulatory update and to present some topics, including marijuana, including the opioid crisis, et cetera, from a perspective of DOT regulations and DOT policy. So that's about me. It says a bunch of stuff, but anyway, we'll go on to that. So I'm going to cover the significant regulatory changes in the past year under the Department of Transportation anti-drug and alcohol misuse prevention rules. I will also then talk a little bit about prescription drug use, abuse, and misuse, and particularly the interface with Department of Transportation regulations, et cetera. And I will talk about the DOT's position on medical and recreational marijuana, and even some tangential things with regard to where I think that's going to go. Not that I necessarily have a crystal ball, but just in terms of what I think employers need to be aware of in that regard. And then I was asked to cover one of the issues that is part of the regulatory update, which is some re-emphasis and some refinement of the processes for medical review officers when they review prescription medications and need to make some kind of an assessment, if you will, about fitness for duty considerations or a safety concern. And so I'm going to cover those topics. And then lastly, a little bit about what I would, some recommendations I have and the benefit of working literally with hundreds of clients every year about what you may want to consider as an employer in making sure that you have some form of medication disclosure and medication use policies in place. Many of us haven't really updated our basic policies, you know, since the 1990s, and that was not as much of an issue. It did not need to be addressed to the extent that it certainly does today. Okay. What the DOT did this year in 2018 was that they put out a substantial revision of the Part 49 CFR, 49 CFR Part 40. And the significant change in that, there were some others that I will go over, but the most significant change was that for the first time, even though we had been trying for literally 7 years to get testing under DOT or other federal testing to include the synthetic opioids, hydrocodone, hydromorphone, oxycodone, and oxymorphone. It finally came to fruition in 2018. Now, many of you may wonder why. Why is the DOT so far behind the power curve? I mean, obviously, the opiate crisis, by the time we got this testing in, was really beginning to wane. You know, we had seen the huge escalation and the plateauing when it was beginning. There was beginning to be some change in that. And the reason is that the Department of Transportation's regulations are very, very tied by statute to only testing for Schedule 1 and Schedule 2 drugs. Schedule 1 and Schedule 2, the illicit drugs that cannot be used for any medical purpose, and Schedule 2 drugs, which are the most highly addicting and the most dangerous of the drugs. And they can be prescribed, but their prescribing is very, very much controlled. And so it wasn't until there were formulations of both hydrocodone and OxyContin that were Schedule 2 drugs that we could then add them to the panel. So that was one of the reasons. And once that happened, then the DOT did move forward. So this is what has happened thus far in 2018. And of course, we don't have a lot of data yet, But looking at the, some laboratory data from one of the laboratory systems that probably does about a third, close to a third of federal testing annually. And you can see here what they show for the first quarter of 2018. So that the opiates, the positive, now this is laboratory data, the positive rate is 0.17%. That's for your morphine and your codeine. The semi-synthetic opiates, which would, in this case, in terms of how laboratories are able to classify the data, would be the hydrocodone and the hydromorphone. And then lastly, the oxycodones, which would be the oxycodone and the oxymorphone. So you see, of course, the highest is for the hydrocodone and the hydromorphone. Not surprising, because that is the most prescribed narcotic painkiller in the US, by far. We always talk about OxyContin and oxycodone being the big, you know, bugaboos, but it's really hydrocodone and hydromorphone that are more heavily prescribed and are more, I would say, certainly are abused and misused even more than oxycodone. Okay, and then oxycodone accounts for 0.63%. So that's the laboratory data that we have. How does this compare to what we thought? It's about what we thought it would be, a little bit lower than what we had projected that the positive rate would be for the opiates beginning in 2018. Now, lab data, but in reality, the vast majority of opiate positives, the opioid class now, for hydrocodone, hydromorphone, oxycodone, oxymorphone, codeine, and morphine, the vast majority of those positives are verified by the medical review officer as negative. How many? Probably close to 80 to 85% of them. So 80 to 85% of the laboratory positives, the medical review officer has a prescription that is presented to me that is valid and written in the person's name, and so they are, by regulation, required to report that to you, the employer, for a DOT test or other federal test as a negative test, okay? So, when they put in the opioid testing, anticipating that there were going to be more laboratory positives for these drugs than we had seen with just the codeine and morphine, opiate drugs, they also put in new medical review officer procedures and processes for the MROs in terms of disclosing and reporting medication safety information or fitness for duty considerations to you, the employer. One of the other things that people wonder, why was there so much hullabaloo in the preamble to the document about defining what a prescription was or what prescribed medication meant? And really the reason was that the DOT wanted to further protect the fact that marijuana in any of the states now, whether it was prescribed or recommended or ordered or whatever by the marijuana doctors, would not meet the definition of prescribed controlled substance according to under DOT rules. So they refined that definition so that it says that the MRO can only consider as a valid alternative medical explanation a prescription that is written in conformance to the Controlled Substance Act. Well, if something is scheduled as a Schedule I drug, is it legal to write a prescription for it? No. Schedule I has things like LSD, for example, right? That has heroin, for example. It's not legal to write prescriptions in accordance with the Controlled Substance Act. So that was a significant, it wasn't a change really, but it was a further clarification to make certain that we didn't end up in, the Department of Transportation and DOT regulated employers didn't end up in court and say, well, he has a legitimate prescription, you know, written by a doctor who has a DEA authorization. So that was part of what was done there. And then in 2018, the first of the DOT agencies that had to raise the random testing rate as a deterrent move because the data from 2016 in the oil and gas pipeline industry bumped above 1% positive rate for random drug tests. Remember, the random rate for the industry is determined not by the overall positive rate in that industry, but by the positive or violation rate for random drug tests. So that creeped up in 2016, and therefore the positive rate for testing, meaning the selection rate, the minimum number or the minimum percentage that oil and gas operators. I happen to think, although I have not been able to get any of my former colleagues at the Department of Transportation to necessarily agree with me, I happen to believe that 2016 was really the first year that the Pipeline Hazardous Materials Safety Administration got a handle on contractor data. And so, of course, contractor data that has to be submitted is figured into that along with, quote, operator data. And so I think that's what made that bump in 2018, and it is likely to stay at a 50% rate for 2019. And the Federal Transit Administration just released last week that their random testing rate will go from 25 to 50% for 2019. I've had some recent conversations with the people at the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration and the US Coast Guard that indicate at least their preliminary data from their industry shows that the random positive drug rate in those industries is going to be over 1%. And why is it? What are the more positives for? Opiates? No, we weren't testing opiates because this is 2017 data, remember. We're always a year behind in terms of what we use to put out the random rate. Yeah, it was from the medicalization, the legalization, the whatever you call it, okay, and the whole attitude really in this country that marijuana is not harmful, it doesn't impact what I do at work. So the marijuana positives have gone up, and surprisingly enough, the methamphetamine positives are climbing in a couple of these industries. So that's probably what has accounted for that. Okay, so this is the definition of prescription now. A prescription must be consistent with the Controlled Substances Act, and that is to make sure that, the key point is to make sure that the prescription is legally valid. So thus, regardless of any state medical marijuana laws, there cannot be a legally valid prescription for marijuana today because it is a Schedule I drug. And I'm going to say more about that in just a minute. The disappointment I had, even though I was really glad that they went with this definition, I really wanted the DOT to also come out and say that medical review officers should not, could not, accept a prescription for hydrocodone that was written 4 years ago. I really wanted them to do that. I wanted them to include something about that it had to be consistent with current authorized medical condition or medical use, or written or dispensed within 12 months, or something like that. But they did not do it. That's because now the people doing all this at DOT, unlike me, are lawyers. And whenever you get lawyers doing this, see, it's always a bad scene. Okay, in terms of what they can, what we can defend, what we can do, what we have to have as the core or the bottom of it. So DOT did not set a time limit on the issue of a legally valid prescription. And I just want to point this out because if you're thinking about it in terms of your own policies or in your work with your medical review officers, that you cannot take a use by date. A lot of prescriptions that you get filled will have a use by, and usually that date is a year from when it has been dispensed. Sometimes it may be a little shorter than that, but that is not an expiration date in terms of when that's a valid prescription for me to take. That is much more designed, and really, the root of that is in terms of whether or not the medication is still effective, because some medications, antibiotics and some other kinds of things, age, and they may not be as effective, and that's why there's a use date by it, not in terms of when it is legally valid for the individual to use. Okay, so what do I think's coming? The Department of Transportation is awaiting action by the Department of Health and Human Services and SAMHSA on the use of oral fluid and hair specimens for federally regulated drug testing. And I wish I could tell you that I think that one or both of those is going to happen this year. I wish I could tell you that one of these things is going to definitely happen before my 75th birthday, but that is now much closer than I like, and it's obviously much closer than the federal government is able to go forward at this point. Despite the fact that there have been congressional acts, there have been letters and other things to the Secretary of Transportation and to the Secretary of Health and Human Services, certainly supporting and trying to, to light the fire, so to speak, that we can get the use of hair and or oral fluid specimens in federally mandated drug testing. And part of that is for a couple of reasons. One certainly is, as I was speaking to a former colleague of mine, Pam Mason, this morning, I said, I never realized back in 1988 that I knew that all this whole drug testing and transportation was going to start a whole bunch of new businesses, if you will, in terms of medical review officers, third-party administrators, laboratories. There were only 13 laboratories that were accredited to do drug testing when we started, and then that blossomed to 50-some. What I didn't count on that was also going to absolutely give birth to a cottage industry of how to beat a drug test, a urine drug test in particular. So we have potions, we have pills, we have apparatus, we have whatever. My personal favorite is the 1995 freeze-dried urine nuggets. Just add a half a cup of hot water and presto, you have pee. But that's an example. And we've never been able to catch up, from a laboratory perspective, to identify the cheaters. Because it's just like I've worked a lot in the world of athletic testing and the world Anti-Doping Association. And every time we try to be able to test for a new steroid or a new anabolic agent or a new way to cheat on erythropoietin, as soon as we develop and norm the laboratory standards, guess what? They've changed it by just this much. And that's the same thing with the adulterants. We're always chasing our tail in terms of being able to identify. We come up with 17 things to find out that it's synthetic urine, and then sure enough, the markers that we're looking at, they will take out or they will put in. So that's one of the reasons that I think many people have said that we really would like to be able to have additional matrices available where perhaps not only is it not as easy to cheat, but the cheating industry is not as well developed. It may take a while before that occurs. So I do think that that's still on track to happen. But I want to, again, be the bearer of bad news. Let's say that SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse Mental Health Services Administration, put out their mandatory guidelines for hair testing and for oral fluid testing tomorrow. The Department of Transportation has to go through a complete rulemaking process to adopt that for DOT testing, because the mandatory guidelines only apply to the testing of federal employees. And so DOT has to then go through the rulemaking to say, okay, it's in the HHS guidelines or the SAMHSA guidelines, and now here's how we're going to apply this in the transportation regulatory realm. So I think from the day that we get a final rule on hair testing or the day that we get a final rule on oral fluid testing, I still think that we're probably a year to 18 months at best out from actually implementing that. Why do I say that? Both oral fluid testing and hair testing are laboratory based. What is an essential component of federal testing that's not going to go away for drug testing, whether it's urine, hair, or oral fluid? Is that my neck? Man, it's time for plastic surgery. Okay. It's the laboratory certification program. So hair testing labs, oral fluid labs, et cetera, they're going to have to go through the whole certification process, all the efficiency testing, et cetera. So that is a thing that's going to take some time. There's no question. But is it coming? Yes, I do think we will see it. The other thing that is in place to begin operation or implementation in 2020, January of 2020, is the National Clearinghouse for positive and refusals to test on commercial drivers. Thank goodness, because this has been a real loophole, if you will, in terms of being able to make sure that we are trying to, that the drug and alcohol testing program has an impact by getting people to get help and to getting them into recovery and for them remaining abstinent from prohibited drugs and free from abusing or misusing alcohol. And so once the database goes into effect, it will be very, very difficult for a person with a commercial driver's license to simply quit one employer and go to another, falsify their application or other information, and get hired. Because everybody, in a good economy, truck drivers are needed all the time. And so that contributes to the fact that it's very easy for these people to continue to use drugs and go from employer to employer. So the database, again though, it's not 100%. I was hoping it would be for all DOT testing, right? But it's not. It is only for testing done under FMCSA and for those employees that have commercial driver's licenses. Okay, let's take a look at prescription drug use, abuse and misuse. And I want to just give you a little bit of data in terms of in the US today. Certainly the National Transportation Safety Boards, every single report that I read from them, I would tell you 1 out of 10 times there's some indication that prescribed drugs may have been involved in, contributing to, or at least tangentially or correlated to traffic, fatal traffic or fatal transportation accidents. The Office of National Drug Control Policy has used to be only dealing with things like, cocaine and methamphetamine, illicit drug trafficking, demand reduction, et cetera. But now, interestingly enough, a majority of the work that they are doing is looking at this whole thing, from the opioid crisis to all the issues having to do with prescription misuse. For the first time, 4 years ago, the National Survey on Drug Use and Health, which is a self-report, stratified sampling data of magnanimous proportions in terms of the number of people, that is done by SAMHSA every year, starting in 2012 and continuing now exponentially through 2016, the last year for which data is available, has had misuse or abuse of prescription drug use as the second highest category in drug use. In other words, marijuana is first, current users in terms of what are they using or abusing. Marijuana is first, prescription painkillers and prescription mood-altering drugs such as antidepressants and anti-anxiety drugs, et cetera, is second. Then comes cocaine, and then comes methamphetamine. Now, methamphetamine has flipped over cocaine in the last 2 years. But really, prescription drug use is right up there. When we say that 9.2% of people in the US, 12 years and older, acknowledge in the national survey that they have either used an illicit drug, or they have abused or misused, stolen or gotten a prescription narcotic, a scheduled drug, when that's 10.2% of everybody over 12 years of age. And then when you look at the percentage for illicit drug misuse and abuse, that's at 3% of everybody over 12%, over 12 years old. So it's nothing to sneeze at in terms of the numbers and to being able to take a look at how it impacts us as employers and the workforce. So I've given a few definitions here about what am I talking about with prescription drug use, misuse, and abuse. And certainly, abuse and misuse of prescribed medications take several forms. Using it longer than it is medically indicated to use for, using it in higher doses than was recommended or originally prescribed, either because a tolerance is built up, because if I take one and I feel a little loopy, if I take two, I can feel nice and loopy. So it will, more is better type thing. Use in combination with other drugs. Sometimes that's intentional and sometimes that's unintentional. But certainly the culprit here is both marijuana and alcohol. And so that when prescription drug medications, anti-anxiety medications, sleep medications, controlled substance sleep medications are taken in combination with those other drugs. Again, think of it in terms of what you hear in the celebrity world. When you say that so-and-so died of a drug overdose, how many times is this a combination of prescribed medications, maybe, right? Illicit drugs, and what else? Booze, right? No question about it. Okay, and then the last thing is that it is considered to be misuse or abuse of a prescription medication if you use it while performing tasks for which it is contraindicated. So if somebody is using their prescribed narcotic painkiller when it says should not operate machinery or a vehicle or whatever, that is considered misuse or abuse. So I just want you to get a feel for how, what we're defining here in that whole statistic. So what do we know about the last decade, and particularly since about 2010. If we're taking, there's been a dramatic increase in the use of controlled substance medications to treat chronic pain, anxiety, depression, and/or attention deficit disorders. I mean, if any of you still watch television, cable or otherwise, I mean, you can't get away. There is a pill for everything, right? I mean, the ones I love now are, if your current medications for depression and anxiety are not quite working, let's add these two to it. So we have pills on top of pills to deal with all manner of things. And so the issue is that not only are the number of prescriptions written increasing, the number of conditions for which controlled substance medications are being written has skyrocketed. When it used to be take 2 aspirin and call me in the morning, now it's take 3 Xanax and call me in the morning, or do whatever, right? Or take 2 Ambiens and call me. Medication interactions are often unknown and are not monitored because people get multiple medications from several different physicians. And in this era of specialization, et cetera, it seems like nobody can have just one doctor anymore. They have multiple doctors or multiple, healthcare practitioners. And so again, oftentimes you would think with everything being electronic records now that Dr. X would know what Dr. Y has prescribed for Donna Smith, but that's not at all necessarily the case. An aging population is being prescribed more and more drugs. There's no question about that. And even our workforce, as we get an aging workforce in many industries today, that is indicative that they will probably be taking more prescription drugs. And painkillers, tranquilizers, and sleep aids are certainly readily available via the internet, and it's not necessarily something that you any longer have to go to a psychiatrist or other specialists in those fields. They're very, very, and I think it's interesting. I've had the experience that many healthcare practitioners are very, very liberal prescribers of pain medications. I had to have some extractions done and an implant, another sign of age, right? And so my oral surgeon hands me 60 Vicodin, a prescription for 60 Vicodin. I said, whoa, if I need to take 60 Vicodin, you have been, I need to be talking about malpractice here. There's no way that you could screw this up bad enough that I need to have 60 Vicodin. And I said, how about just writing me a prescription for 10, see if I need them the first couple of days. Oh, I really can't write a prescription for 10. I have to do a 30-day supply because of your insurance or whatever. I mean, really? I mean, it's become an embedded part, if you will, of our healthcare and of our society. He probably just figured if I took at least 20 of them, I wouldn't call him. Okay. Here is some interesting data that comes out of the Department of Labor and also out of, oops, oh, that was clever. Oh, no, did I do that? I have no idea. Man. See, we just need to go back to the day. Remember the overhead projector with the transparencies? You know, I could just kind of sit there. I had a microphone. I could walk around. Thank you. Where were we? Okay, here's where we are. So these are some of the impacts that employers report with regard to prescription drug abuse, prescription drug misuse, et cetera. So for example, at the bottom, 39% of employers who were surveyed by these DOL and other survey instruments said that they had, within the past 30 days, had at least one instance of absenteeism or missed work that was due to a person having a prescription drug problem or prescription drug abuse or misuse. And the same kind of thing goes up to the other kinds of indicators or impacts that we see from prescription drug abuse and misuse, et cetera. I wanted to show you the friends and family plan. This is how most people get their drugs that they are misusing or abusing. They aren't getting them from multiple doctors. They aren't getting them from their own doctor who is overprescribing or prescribing multiple, but the majority of them are getting them from friends or relatives, and they're getting them free. For those that do not have nice friends and relatives, then you have another 13% that steal them or take them from grandma's closet or from someone else, from their friend or relative. And so this is, and then you look at over here, where did the friend or the relative, where did grandma, I have to have another, I'm a grandma now, so I gotta have another stereotype, but where did that friend, where did that relative get the drugs from? And you can see there that it is the majority from one doctor. I do have a colleague, a friend, not a colleague, a friend where I live, and I had to take her to the Walgreens or whatever, and she comes out with this boatload of whatever, and I said, and she was showing me these medications, and I said, what are you taking hydrocodone and oxycodone for? Oh, well, I got that after my surgery with my knee, and I said, and so why are you getting it now? That was 3 years ago. Well, you know, when I go in, they ask me if I ever had any pain in that knee, and I say, yeah, occasionally, you know, when I do 22 stairs or whatever, and I just don't want to be without it. So she gets them filled every month, whether she needs it or not. I mean, she probably has a stockpile. But then it was interesting when she said, well, occasionally my daughter asks me for some. So, I mean, again, the enabling behavior, et cetera. But it's not that far, I don't think. I don't think that's really out there. I think that happens more than we would think. Okay, so what else? I want to talk about DOT and medical marijuana and recreational marijuana. With DOT, it is simple. They say not only no, but H no. No way, no how, no form, don't talk to me about impairment, don't talk to me about whatever. The answer is no. So for a safety-sensitive position, the employer is not crazy laws like Oklahoma or Connecticut or whatever, which say that an employer cannot take an adverse or other employment action against someone who has a valid medical marijuana card. That does not necessarily apply to DOT, because for DOT testing, obviously, they can't be qualified to continue to work in their DOT position if they are using marijuana. Okay, so the this is what, essentially what DOT did, which I think was kind of smart. They put out the guidance saying to the medical review officer, Dr. Smith, you cannot overturn a THC positive, tetrahydrocannabinol, the drug that it's tested for. You can't overturn that to negative if somebody gives you a valid medical marijuana card. You are not allowed to make that a negative test. You must report that as a positive test. They then had a policy statement about recreational marijuana. 2012 was the first of the states that enacted some specific recreational use laws, and so DOT wanted to, as you can see, we want to make it perfectly clear that the state initiatives will have no bearing on the Department of Transportation's regulated drug testing program. Therefore, medical review officers will not verify a test as negative based upon learning that the employee used recreational marijuana where states have passed recreational marijuana initiatives. This is no different, quite frankly, than the guidance that has been out there for medical review officers for years in terms of explaining a THC positive by passive inhalation or by some kind of exposure, or by some kind of circumstances. Somebody put it in my drink, in my food. We went to 10 concerts in a row. We traveled 400 miles in a Volkswagen Beetle with the windows rolled up. No, the MRO can't take any of that. Well, it's the same kind of thing here. It doesn't matter. The MRO cannot accept that as an explanation for the test. But here, I do want to point this out. If I've had one thing in the past month that people have called me about that has really caused some confusion, there are many employers out there that think that CBD oil can be used by DOT-regulated employees. And guess what? It cannot. CBD is still a Schedule I drug. It's whether you agree that it should be or shouldn't be. Now, from a standpoint of drug testing, it shouldn't be an issue because the federal drug test doesn't test for cannabidiol. It only tests for tetrahydrocannabinol. So cannabidiol should not, it doesn't metabolize to THC. It doesn't even trigger the screening assay for THC. So it shouldn't show up at all. The problem is it does come from the marijuana plant. Now, there are some CBDs that come from industrial hemp plants, and industrial hemp plants are less likely to have any contamination from THC. But when the CBD oil is being manufactured and processed from the cannabis sativa, from the marijuana plant, it's advertised to be THC-free. Well, maybe it's not exactly THC-free. It may have a trace of THC. Well, in the state laws, when you look them up that have passed legislation for the use of CBD, often early on it was talked about in oil form as like Charlotte's Web and all that kind of thing. Now, not only in terms of intractable seizures in children, but CBD is now being recommended by thousands and thousands of physicians. It will lower your cholesterol. It will help your pain. It will relieve anxiety. It will do a number of, so it's got a lot of claims at this point. But the states that have enacted it have said that the CBD oil that is sold, and remember, it's not regulated by the FDA. It's not a medicine per se. It's very much like a supplement or something else that is not regulated. And so it does contain, many of the states allow up to 5% weight to volume, or up to 5% in relationship to the content of THC. So 95% THC and 5% CBD, excuse me, the opposite, 5% THC and 95% CBD is okay. So, but what happens is that if a person tests positive for THC, but they claim that all that they have been using is either vaping their CBD oil or using their CBD oil or some other form of CBD, how do we know that that's what it's from? There is literally no way to tell. And so basically from a DOT perspective, again, the medical review officer cannot overturn a THC positive when the person talks about using CBD oil for what may be perceived as a legitimate or any other usage. So that's something that people were not aware of. Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration did put out a statement to this effect, and there's a very good document available from the Department of Health and Human Services, the Division of Drug-Free Workplace Programs, that talks about CBD and the fact that it is a Schedule I drug, et cetera. Okay, so taking a look at medication safety concerns. We've had medication safety concerns in the DOT rule now for many years. Initially, it was at the discretion of the medical review officer whether to raise any fitness for duty considerations relative to medical information that the donor may have disclosed during their drug verification interview and test verification interview. Then a couple of years after that, it was changed not to the MRO's discretion, but to the it must. The medical review officer must disclose medical information under 2 circumstances. And so now the language in DOT is really continues to only be what the medical review officer must do. It doesn't anywhere tell you as the employer what you must do or can do or should do when it comes to handling medication or medical information disclosures from the medical review officer to you. So let's take a look at this now. So here's the 2 circumstances that the medical review officer must disclose medical information to include medication, medical records, medical diagnoses or medical conditions, when the information is likely to result in the employee being determined to be medically unqualified under an applicable DOT agency rule. And secondly, and this is the one that is most frequently, that we find most frequently, the information indicates that continued performance by the employee of his or her safety function is likely to pose a significant safety risk. So that's the circumstance. If that's the conclusion that the MRO draws, that a person who is working in a job where they are climbing up ladders that are 4 stories high, where they're working around hazardous materials, where they are operating machinery, et cetera, and they believe that continued performance by the employee of his or her safety function is likely to pose a significant safety risk, they must disclose that. So we were kind of going along with this without any problem. And then when the opioids change was made to the reg, DOT made some additional changes. But I want you to notice here so lest you think that this is worse than it is. There is nothing that says that the word safety concern or medication itself, it talks only about medical information, and the employee's consent to disclose this medical information is not required. Remember, HIPAA does not apply here. HIPAA does not apply to DOT drug testing in terms of the interaction between the medical review officer and the employee, and the medical review officer's duty to disclose medical information without the employee's written consent. So it goes on to enumerate the parties to whom the MRO is authorized to disclose this medical information to, and that is they can provide it as also, that can be the employer, that can be the medical examiner who has done the qualifications for the person's commercial driver's license, DOT driver qualification, a mariner qualification document, or a aviation medical examiner who has done the pilot's medical authorization or medical certification. It does go on to say also that there is an exception to disclosing that if the applicable laws of a foreign country prohibit such disclosure. That's where we kind of get into some routine with our neighbors to the north in terms of there are greater protections for what can be disclosed there. Okay, what does the MRO tell the employee at the beginning of the verification interview? And this was the change that was made in terms of something was added. So it says that obviously the MRO has to give them what we often refer to as a medical Miranda warning, and that is that, thank you, that we're going to, I'm going to ask you information about your medical history, about medications, because the point is to see if there's an alternative medical explanation for your drug test. And so they warn them up front and say, if you don't want to disclose any of that to me, you don't have to, but then I will report the test, right, as positive without the information to substantiate or to document, validate a legitimate medical explanation. So medical information includes the information on medications and other substances. So what DOT did this time is they added this paragraph, 40.135E. And this went all kinds of crazy. It said that before, the MRO would verify the test results, say it's negative, it is explained by the person's prescription for Diadrex, or it's explained by the person's prescription for morphine sulfate, right? And they would just report it as negative, and then with a safety concern, because morphine sulfate and or Diadrex could certainly have safety or fitness for duty considerations depending on what the dosage is, when it's taken, and what the person's job is. And so they would report it negative with safety concern, or negative with medication concern, or negative with fitness for duty. Now they have to report the negative and wait until at least 5 days have passed, or wait for the number of days until the donor's prescribing healthcare practitioner contacts the MRO for the MRO to see whether or not the prescribing healthcare practitioner is willing to discontinue the medication or to change it to a medication that the medical review officer will not have a significant safety risk associated with. So that now means that particularly on a pre-employment test, an employer is going to get a negative. They're going to hire the person. 3 days later, they're going to get a safety concern. So now the employer is stuck with, what do I do to resolve it? And so that has been the major hiccup, if you will, in what the DOT, and this was not something that physicians or employers had an opportunity to comment on because it wasn't a part of the proposed regulation. And so we were kind of blindsided when then this new paragraph arose out of thin air in the final regulation in January. I won't go through this because I'm running out of time, but this is basically saying that some MROs went to Patrice Kelly, the director of ODAPSI, and said, are there any circumstances where we can report it right away? And she said yes. If the donor says, I'm not even going to contact my doctor, you do what you have to do, he knows what I'm taking, I'm not going to mess with it, then you can report it right away. If the medical condition or the medication itself is disqualifying. For example, the person's medication is a anti-seizure medication, and seizures are disqualifying automatically for pilots and for commercial drivers. Then you can report that right away. So that's kind of the deal on this. Here is what ODAPSI put out to employers to give to their employees, saying, here's your responsibility. You, as an employee, need to understand that you have to facilitate the contact between the MRO and your prescribing physician. That the prescribing physician should be willing to state to the MRO that the employee can safely perform safety-sensitive functions while taking the medications or consider changing your medication. Let me just mention that I did a little bit of a survey of medical review officers in the US for another presentation I was doing recently, and the majority of the MROs tell me that less than 60% of the employees even have their doctor call. They basically say, forget about it. I am not going to have the doctor contact you, etc. And of those that do, then the MROs that I've spoken with and communicated with say that the only less than 10% of the time is the doctor, prescribing doctor, willing to discontinue or change the medication. So we're right back where we started from in terms of some kind of fitness for duty. Okay, so what I want to end that part with is here. Here are the three options, and this is, I think, probably the most important slide of this section in terms of if you get a safety concern reported to you as an employer, on a DOT test from a medical review officer. This really, you need to take one or more of these 3 approaches to resolve that concern. I did contact about 22 employers, large, medium, and small, at the same time about what are they doing with safety concerns. I was dismayed to find out that a small percentage of them, 10% of them, said, again, small sample, so, but a couple of them said, oh, we just ignore it. God, the liability there is not good. Maybe it's not going to matter, but your risk is considerable, I think. Once you have that report that that you really do need in some way to resolve it. The majority of them, if they will have them re-examined for a DOT medical exam, but the other, they do not take a note from the prescribing doctor. They don't feel that's going to be worth anything, so they have them evaluated, a fitness for duty evaluation by an occupational health specialist. Okay, so this is a presentation that some of you may have even attended the webinar that I did for DISA a number of months ago now on medication disclosure and policies and how to craft them. So I'm not going to spend much time on this, but I think the key thing here is that you need to limit the scope of employees to whom medication policy applies. So you cannot necessarily just have a one-size-fits-all, that every employee that you have, whether that is a secretary, a custodian, a salesperson, or a person that operates, a huge pneumatic crane, that they have exactly the same policy with regard to medication disclosure and that kind of thing. So you have to really be able to assess and evaluate what is the potential risk associated with not having good information, medical information about your employees. Certainly for employees that you require medical exams for on a recurring or whatever basis, that cover essential job functions, certainly that's a perfect opportunity for you to dovetail that with medication disclosure, medication reviews. Remember, HIPAA and DOT, not a problem. HIPAA and non-DOT. It is my opinion that in the majority of circumstances, HIPAA does not apply to your non-DOT testing. Where it gets dicey is whether or not the prescribing physician or the pharmacist or whoever you or the MRO is trying to communicate with may not want to disclose or to talk to the MRO or to you or to your medical department without having their employee or their patient, sign HIPAA documents. But I mean, different lawyers disagree in terms of the full application of HIPAA. Okay, so I'm going to be around this afternoon at 5 o'clock, I guess. We're having a networking session, and I'd be happy to answer any of your questions. And you will have these slides, so the things that I skipped over very quickly, you'll have a chance to look at, and you can always contact me at Current Consulting, and I will be happy to answer your individual questions. So thanks a lot. You were a great group.